A friend had come out, he told his parents that he was gay, and his parents didn't like that, so they kicked him out of the house. And so him, as a teenager, became homeless.
I realized that I was gay at the age of 8. At that time, I realized that I was confronted with this dilemma in regards to my upbringing, like, what does this mean? How do I change? This isn't right. My life's horrible. I'm horrible.
Home should be a safe place, and for some queer students, school cannot be a safe place, while home is also not a safe place. And what do you do when you're bound within these two institutions, between the institution of the family that you have to go home to at 3 o'clock, and then back to school at 9 a.m. the next day? And if that school is not supportive, as a student, you're really in a position of precarity and unsafety.
We don't know what the home environment is like for our students that we're teaching. And there's a great chance that our classroom or our presence or the presence of their other teachers are the only positive, accepting place or person that they have in their life.
And this is why SOGI policies matter in schools, because they provide a place for students to feel supported and safe when they might not be supported at home.
So SOGI is a fairly new term. It stands for Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity. I like the term because it doesn't rely on labels. SOGI is inclusive because we all have a sexual orientation and we all have a gender identity.
What we've noticed this year with teacher candidates, not everyone comes to the program with a broad set of experiences. And so for some of our teacher candidates, as well as teachers in the field, the notion of sexual orientation and gender identity and variance or non-binary ways of being, that's still really new for some people.
So I know SOGI terminology can seem a bit complex when you're just starting and learning about these issues for the first time. There's a few things that I always say. First of all, it's important to learn the basics. So language changes from person to person sometimes, but there's some terms that kind of apply across the board. I always like to start at the beginning, which is when a baby is born, often we look down at their genitals and we decide based on that whether that child is going to be a boy or a girl, right? So we assign that child a gender.
And we know, in fact, that there is middle ground, that people are born, many people are born as intersex, which means that they have characteristics of both male and female. So if there is middle ground anatomically, surely there's also middle ground in terms of our own individual understandings of our gender. And so that's where the concept of gender identity comes to.
Being cisgender is a term that we use to refer to people whose gender that they were assigned at birth is the same as the gender that they currently identify with. So transgender people, unlike cisgender people, have a gender identity or a gender that isn't the same as the gender that they were assigned at birth.
So it's important to see gender as a spectrum.
So non-binary students are students who identify outside of sort of our traditional gender categories, right? So usually we think of boys and girls or men and women. And non-binary students are students who identify either in between or outside of these categories.
Sexual orientation is different than gender identity. So your gender identity is really your concept of who you are. Your sexual orientation is who you are attracted to.
Queer historically is a slur. It's a slur that was used against people who were not heterosexual in order to put them down. And so it's a term that was reclaimed in the late 80s, early 90s by people to say, if I take this term on, then you can't hurt me with it. And so now people have continued to use this term, and it's become much more common as sort of an umbrella term, right? A term that's really inclusive of all kinds of identities that are not heterosexual identities. Mirror the language that people use about themselves. So make sure that you're listening and sort of have a humble attitude, right? I've been doing this work for a really long time, and there are still terms that I've never heard. There's lots of cultures in the world, including a lot of Indigenous cultures actually here in Canada, that have thought about gender and sex in very different ways.
The term Two-Spirit, for me, it's just kind of a way of acknowledging that many First Nations communities knew and accepted the idea of gender fluidity.
But what it is I have two spirits inside of me, and one is masculine and one is feminine. And sometimes they conflict quite a bit, but or one outbears the other, but they're in there, and that's why they call us two-spirited.
It's not just an identity, it's a role that people played in their First Nations communities.
In First Nations culture, two-spirited people were seen as very powerful people because they could see things from two perspectives. So a long time ago in our villages, we were held up and just shown and treated like we were very special.
The way that gender is fluid, the way it moves, I think Two-Spirit is just a really great way of encapsulating that. While it's not an identity that someone who isn't Indigenous can identify as, it's still something that is a great way of talking about gender and the way that we've traditionally viewed gender.
Yeah, the concept of intersecting identities is really beautiful. Me being gay, an immigrant, and a person of color, and I can't choose one being more important than the other part of my identity.
There are multiple points of identity that matter. Young people struggle with not only their sexuality, but also that kind of push and pull around race and faith. We have a lot of young Christian Chinese folks in those schools who are out and very proud to be themselves, but they might have parents who are, really against the policy changes that are happening at their district level. How do we talk to them about their sexual orientation, gender identity without them necessarily having to abandon their faith or their culture and family?
To help students who are wrestling with gender identity or sexual orientation and put that together with their faith, it can be a real challenge, because often there were going to be expressions of faith that are anti-gay, anti-lesbian, anti-gender identity that is not binary. I think it is a little more of a challenge for those educators who come from a strong faith position that is not supportive of the LGBT community or gender identity, but I think they also then need to do some homework. Their first call is to be supportive and caring for the students that are with them, for whom they have responsibility, to recognize that they need not insist on their own religious beliefs, that they're in a setting where in fact they need to be open to all.
This is expected within our school communities, that we do not tolerate discrimination in any form, and that we want to make sure that we have an inclusive environment in which all students feel accepted, cared for, cared about, and have an opportunity to express themselves in a manner that they feel comfortable.
Research shows that students learn better when they feel safe. They can't learn if they don't feel safe. Transphobia, homophobia, these types of behaviors create a negative culture within the school. So that doesn't just affect LGBTQ students. It affects all students. Sometimes doing the right thing isn't the easy thing. And at the end of the day, this is the right thing to do for our students.
Even if you think that there aren't any LGBTQ people in your school, or if there aren't any students anywhere around who identify that way, there are, even if you don't know it, and that they would really appreciate it if you would take the time to learn about them and try to help them as best as you can.
Like, I don't live with my family. They were not supportive of who I was because of how I identify. I live in a foster home. Having that sense of community here, it gave me a sense of family. I might not have had a safe home, but I had a safe school.